The Radio Planet by Ralph Milne Farley, Chapter 15, Plans for Escape. We can make the alcohol in a few days in my laboratory, Cabot wrote, but it will not do for us to escape too precipitately, lest our plans be discovered and blocked. The Verkings like sleight offhand, and wish to keep me with them as their court musician. Let us bide our time until they become sufficiently accustomed to you, so that they will not question your accompanying me on an expedition. Then away to the plane and off to Cupia. The Ant-Man assented. It seemed logical, and yet I wonder if the logic would not have done credit to Judd the excuse-maker. I wonder if Cabot was not subconsciously influenced by a scientific desire to complete his radio set in this land of people who used only wood and flint. I wonder. At all events, the work proceeded. He had planned to use the slag from the copper furnace as the ore for his iron, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this high sulfur content would probably ruin any steel which he produced. Fortunately, however, he ran across a deposit of magnetic iron ore near Verkini. This he ground and placed in the crucibles with the charcoal, and they built charcoal fires in the pits around them. The slag he skimmed off with copper, later iron ladles. The melting had to be repeated many times in order to purify the iron sufficiently, and further, in order to secure just the right carbon content for a cast iron, steel, or wrought iron, according to which purpose he needed for any particular need. This securing of the proper carbon content was largely a matter of cut and try. The iron and steel available, he now made pots, retorts, hammers, anvils, drills, wire drawing dies, and a decant Bessemer converter. Copper tubes for glass blowing and copper wire were drawn. A simple wooden lathe was made for winding thread around the wires. This thread, by the way, was the only Verkingen product which the Earthman found ready to his hand. As soon as the iron retorts were available, the joint manufacture of sal ammoniac and soda was started, as already outlined by Doggo. In iron pots, Cabot melted together finely ground white sand with lime, soda, and potash, and blew the resulting glass into bottles, retorts, test tubes, and other laboratory apparatus. Also jars for his electric batteries. He used both soda and potash, as this would render the glass more fusible than if made with either alone. Lead was melted from galena crystal into small quantities for solder. Thus was suggested to Doggo the manufacture, on the side, of bullets, gunpowder, and cartridges, for the rifle which Miles had in his quarters, and for the one which lay in the concealed airplane. Tales of the copper smelting had spread among the populace, who evidenced such great interest that the double guards had to be placed and maintained about the laboratory enclosure, and every returning military expedition brought with it samples of unusual minerals. Meanwhile, Cabot instituted a regular campaign of getting Verkini accustomed to Doggo. Every day Doggo would parade the high-walled streets, with Quiven the Golden Flame perched upon his back. The 10-foot ant inspired great interest and considerable fear. She enjoyed her rides thoroughly, not only for the novelty of the thing, but also because her seat on this 6-foot-high back brought her head above the level of the fence palings, and thus enabled to survey the private yards of everyone. Tippy had not been seen or heard from. Arkilu the Beautiful thoroughly made up with the Earthman, and even admitted that her love for him had been a mistake. Plans for her wedding with Judd proceeded rapidly. When this coming marriage was publicly announced, At the Terrible sent in a royal runner with the message that he didn't in the least care. Quiven now lived in the palace so as to be near her father, but came to work regularly each day. Theof the Grim interposed no objection to this, and in fact frequently accompanied his daughter to the laboratory. He loved to mess around with the bottles and retorts, and lost much of the grimness when engaged in such childish meddlesomeness. So everyone was happy, except Tippy the Steadfast and At the Terrible. Judd continued the operation of the brickyard, even though Cabot had no more need of bricks, for Judd planned to build himself a brick palace, which would outshine even the wooden palace of King Theof. Melting the platinum for wires presented a problem, until Miles thought of electrolyzing some of the ordinary water into the constituent hydrogen and oxygen, and then burning these two materials together in a double blowpipe, much like that used in oxy acetylite welding. But to do this he had to make batteries. To this end he already had sal ammoniac and jars. He needed carbon and zinc. For carbon, he pressed charcoal into compact blocks to extract zinc from the blend, or he made long cylindrical retorts of clay with a long clay pipe for the vent. The core, after being thoroughly roasted in a copper roasting furnace to remove all sulfur, was ground, mixed with half its weight of powdered charcoal, and then charged into the retorts, where it was baked. The result was to distill the pure zinc, which condensed on the walls of the tubes. Cabot now at last had all the elements for his batteries, and so was able, by employing about 70 cells in multiple, to get the 2 volts, 350 amperes needed to electrolyze the oxygen and hydrogen for melting his platinum. Needless to state, the distilling of alcohol in large quantities, ostensibly for the laboratory burners, but actually for Doggo's airplane, was commenced as soon as they had blown the first glass retorts. Miles was going strong. One day, in the midst of all this technical progress, as Miles was passing through one of the streets of Verkini on some errand or other, the admiring and quaint and brightly colored wood carvings on the high walls which lined the way, his attention was arrested by a design over one of the gateways. It was a crimson swastika with a crimson triangle, the insignia of the priests of the lost religion of Cupia, the priests who had befriended him in their hidden refuge in the caves of Kar, when he was a fugitive during the dark days of his second war against the Ant-Men. Could it be that the lost religion was also implanted upon this continent? Miles had never discussed religion with Arkilu, or Judd, or Quiven, or Crota, or any of his Verking friends. Somehow the subject had never come up. Full of curiosity, Cabot knocked on the door. Immediately a small round aperture opened, and a voice from within inquired, "Whence come you?" For reply, the Earthman gave one of the passwords from the Cupian religion. To his surprise, the gate swung open, and he was admitted into the presence of a long-robed priest clad exactly like his friends of the caves of Kar. "What do you wish?" asked the guardian of the gate. Having made his way so far, Miles decided to continue on the analogy of the religion of his own continent. Accordingly, he boldly replied, "I wish to speak with the holy leader." "Very well," said the guard, and closing the gate and barring it, he led Miles through many winding passages to a door on which he knocked 3 times. The knock was repeated from within, and the door opened, and Miles entered to gaze upon a strangely familiar scene. The room was richly carved and colored. On 3 sides hung the stone lamps of the Verkings. Around the walls sat a score or more of long-robed priests, some on high level and some on slightly raised platforms. On the highest platform of all, directly opposite of the point where Cabot had entered, sat the only hooded figure in the chamber, quite evidently the leader of the faith. Him the Earthman approached and bowed low, whereat there came the unexpected words, "Welcome to Verkini, Miles Cabot." Then the priest descended, took the visitor by the hand, and led him to a seat at his own left. A few minutes later the assembly had been temporarily suspended, and Miles and his host were chatting together like old friends. Miles told the venerable prelate the complete history of all his adventures on both continents of the planet Saporos, not omitting to dwell with considerable detail upon the vicissitudes of the lost religion of Cupia. This interested the priest greatly, and he asked numerous questions in that connection. "Strange, strange," he ruminated. "It is undoubtedly the same religion as ours, so there must at some time have been some connection between the 2 continents." "Yes, there must have been," the Earthman asserted, "for the written language of both Cupia and Verkini is the same, yet the totally different flora and fauna of the 2 continents negatives this history." "Where did the Cupians originate, if you know?" the priest inquired. "We do not know," Miles replied, "but there are 2 conflicting legends. One is that the forerunners of the race came from across the boiling seas. The other is that they sprang fully formed from the soil. There is also a legend that creatures like me dwell beyond the boiling seas, and that this legend, at least, appears to be borne out by the very existence of your Verkings." "Strange, still more strange," the prelate declared, "for we have but one story of our origin. The race of Verkings descended from another world above the skies. Who knows but that we, like you, came from this place that you call the planet Minos, I think you said?" After some further conversation, the conclave was called to order again, and Miles took this as a signal for his departure. He was given a warm invitation to return. Truly, a new avenue of speculation that had been opened up to him by his chance meeting with the holy leader. Miles firmly resolved to return again at an earliest opportunity. But from this time on events moved with such rapidity that never again did he enter the sacred precincts. First, he was stumped by his radio tubes. How was he to make a vacuum pump which could exhaust the air? The solution, when it finally occurred to him, was absurdly simple. He utilized atmospheric pressure. He made a glass tube 30 feet long and sealed his grid, his plates, and his lead wires into one end, closing that end off hermetically. Then he fashioned a piston of waterproof cloth fiber so as to fit in the closest end, almost touching these elements and yet free to move away from them without tearing them. Then he filled the tube with water and inverted it, but the water did not drop away to the height of about 28 feet, as it would have done on Earth. Of course not, for this was Venus. Venus, of an atmospheric pressure practically equal to that of Earth, holding the water up, and yet with a gravity much less than that of Earth, tending to pull the water down. But by lengthening the pipe sufficiently, Cabot finally got the proper balance. The fiber piston was pulled down, and a partial vacuum, practically free of water vapor, had been created. He then sealed off the upper portion of the glass tube with his blowtorch and had his radio triad. For these radio tubes, the glass was made according to a special formula. Of this same glass, Cabot fashioned lenses for goggles which he and Doggo planned to wear on their trip home across the boiling seas. One of the constituents of this special glass is lead monoxide, commonly known as litharge. This gave the radio man some concern until Doggo suggested melting lead in a rotating cylindrical iron drum with spiral ribs. By pumping cold air in one end of this drum, fine particles of litharge were driven out through the other, where they accumulated in a stationary container. About this time, the king and Judd began clamoring for results, so Cabot made a few electric lights with platinum filaments, and entirely apart from pacifying the two patrons, it was well that he did this, for the speedy burning out of these lights showed him that he had a new problem to face, namely, the elimination of all traces of oxygen in his tubes. He got rid of considerable amounts by placing the tubes in strong magnetic fields while exhausting, but this was not enough. It looked as though his experiments would have to end at this point, for with an immense quantity of alcohol completed, and with Pyrex glass for their goggles, everything was all set for the conspirators to locate Doggo's hidden plane and fly across the boiling seas to Cupia. The Verkings were by now sufficiently used to the huge ant-man and to his participation in Cabot's scientific experiments, so that no objection would be raised to his accompanying the radio man on one of the latter's expedition in search of certain minerals which he believed could be found only in the country. 2 carts, laden with tents, food, and bedding, were taken along, and beneath these supplies he placed the alcohol and goggles. There was no need to conceal them, for none of the Verkings, except Quiven, ever had any very distinct knowledge of what he was about, and to her he explained that the alcohol was for the purpose of loosening certain minerals from solid rocks, and that the goggles were to protect his and Doggo's eyes from the fumes. A squad of soldiers pulled the carts. Doggo had demurred at this, suggesting that the soldiers be left behind and offering to pull them himself, but Miles pointed out how easily he could scatter the Verkings when the time came by threatening them with his magic slingshot, i.e. rifle. Early in the morning they set forth, just as the unseen rising sun began to tint the eastern sky with purple. When the time came to say farewell to Quiven, Miles found to his surprise that his voice was positively choked with emotion. "Goodbye, Golden Flame," he said. "Please wish me a safe journey." "Of course I do," she said. "But why so sad? You sound as though you expected to never see me again." "One can never tell," he replied. "Your food has disagreed with you," she bantered. "I feel confident that you will return, for have you not often quoted to me, 'They cannot kill a Minorian'? Run along now, and come back safely." Thus he left her, a smile on her face and a tear in his eye. He hated to deceive Quiven, who had always been a good little pal, in spite of her occasional flare-ups of temper. He looked back and waved to her where she stood like a golden statue upon the city wall. It would be his last glimpse of a true friend. Then he set his face resolutely to the eastward. Not only did he feel a pang at leaving Quiven, but he felt even more a pang at leaving his radio set half finished. The scientist always predominated in his makeup, and besides, a good workman that he was, he hated an unfinished job. But he realized that the radio project had only been a means to an end, the end being getting in touch with his friends and family in Cupia, and that this end was about to be accomplished more directly. Just think, tomorrow night he would be home, ready to do battle for his loved ones against the usurper, Yuri. The thought thrilled him, and all regrets passed away. Lilla! He was to see his beautiful, dainty Lilla once more, and his baby son Q, rightful ruler of Cupia. He resolved that, once back with them again, he would never more leave them. Lilla had been right. His return to Earth had been foolhardy adventure. Results had proved it. As Poblath, the Cupian philosopher, used to say, the test of a plan is to see how it works out. Cabot was eager, even impatient, to see that the ant-plane, which was to carry him home. He was bubbling over with questions to ask his ant-man companion, the condition of the plane, its exact location, how well it had been concealed, and so forth, but this only mean of communication with Doggo was in writing, and it would never do to delay the expedition for the purpose of indulging in a written conversation. So he merely fretted and fumed, and urged the Ver-King pullers and the carts to a greater speed. But along toward evening a calm settled for him, a joyous calm. He was going home. Going home! The words sang in his ears. He was going to Cupia, to baby Q and Princess Lilla. A nervous warmth flooded through his being and tingled at his fingertips. He felt the strength to overcome any obstacles which might confront him. He was going home. Just before sunset, the party encamped on the outskirts of a small grove of trees, which Doggo indicated as the hiding place of his plane and other supplies. It had already been agreed that they should not inspect the machine before morning, for they did not wish to give even the slow brains of the Ver-King's soldiers a chance to figure out their ulterior motive, and perhaps to dispatch a runner to Ver-Kingi with a warning to Theof or Judd. So Miles was forced to possess his soul in patience and await the dawn. To keep his mind off of troubles, he sat with the furry warriors about their campfire and told them tales of Cupia and of planet Earth. Never before in their experience had this strange, furless leader of theirs been so graciously condescending or sociable. It was an evening which they would long remember. Finally, they all turned in for the night. The Earthman slept fitfully and dreamed of encounters in which, with his back to a wall, he fought with a wooden sword, alone against Prince Yuri and Ant-Men and Ver-Kings and Cupians and whistling bees, in defense of Lilla and her son. Yet, such is the strange alchemy of dreams that sometimes Lilla's face seemed to be covered with golden fur. With the first red flush of morning, Cabot and Doggo bestirred themselves and informed their campmates that they intended to do a bit of prospecting before breakfast. Then they set out into the interior of the wood, the Ant-Man leading the way. At last they came to a small clearing, and beyond it a thicket, which Doggo indicated with one paw as being the spot they sought. There was to be the plane. Parting the foliage, they looked inside. But the thicket was empty. On the further side of the bushes it had been recently chopped down, and thence there lay a wide swath of cut trees clear out into the woods. It was only too evident that the precious plane had been stolen.